Hi, this is Woodwork Designs by Z, and today I'm going to be building 2 walnut end grain cutting boards for a client. Keep watching to see what happens. I first started by cross-cutting that board in half. Somehow I lost the footage of that. Then I planed the boards down because they were still slightly rough from the lumberyard. I wanted to keep the boards as close to 2 inches as possible, so I only planed off as much as I needed. Then I went over to the table saw and I put in a ripping blade. This blade has way fewer teeth and deeper gullets than the combination blade that was in there before. After that, I ripped the edges of the boards to clean them up. This is because they're not perfect from the lumberyard. After that, I moved the fence over so that way I can rip the boards exactly in half. Then I'd cross-cut all the boards down into smaller pieces, except somehow I lost the footage of that as well. But then one of those pieces got ripped in half again. After that, all the boards got arranged in a very nice pattern to try to highlight some of the sapwood and heartwood evenly. Then I got out my long parallel clamp so I can glue up both boards at the same time. I put painter's tape on top of the bars of the clamps because for some reason the glue doesn't scrape off very easily. Then I moved both cutting boards over to the parallel clamps, keeping them in the same orientation which I had them in before. I put painter's tape on top of the piece of walnut that's in between both boards so that they don't end up sticking together. I then applied a liberal amount of glue and spread it around with a glue brush. I had to make sure all the pieces were as flush as possible at this step because I didn't have very much room for error. I also added about every clamp I own, and this board was really heavy at this point. After that, all the clamps came off. Then I took both boards over to the drum sander because they were too wide for my planer. I just had to drum sand them and get them flat. I didn't have to take off very much material here, so it went pretty quickly. Then I went back over to the table saw and I set up a stop block so I could rip 2-inch strips. I was still using the same ripping blade as before, but I should have switched over to my cross-cutting blade. The reason I'm making 2-inch strips is so that way I can then turn all the strips up on end and get the end grain pattern. After that, I arranged all the strips. I flipped over every other strip, which staggered the little bricks. I also arranged them in a nice pattern so that way they didn't look like all the heartwood was in one area and all the sapwood was in the other. I then glued up all the boards the same as before. I just added a liberal amount of glue and I spread it around with a glue brush. Then I clamped it again with my parallel clamps. I also checked to make sure they were square because I didn't have very much room for error here. After that, the clamps came off again. Then I took these boards over to the drum sander and I flattened them. This is where a drum sander really shines because you can't put an end grain board through a planer. I then went over to the table saw and I ripped the boards down to their final size. It's crazy how much harder it is to cut through end grain like this, even with a ripping blade. After cutting one side, I then flipped the board over and I cut the other side. I then got out my crosscut sled and I cross-cut the boards. This made sure that they were nice and square. The client had requested juice grooves on these boards, which I had never tried before. So, after I cut the boards to the proper size, I went over to the router table and did a test on a scrap piece of plywood that I cut to the same size as the boards. I used stop blocks in the router table fence to do this, and after doing a little bit of math to get it set up properly, it worked perfectly. So I moved on to doing it on the actual boards. This was a little nerve-wracking because I'd put a lot of work into these boards before this step. Although luckily I nailed it first try. Basically, the way this works is I have those 2 stop blocks set up for the ends, then I remove them and use the other 2 that I have set up for the long edges. I have to make sure the board stays tight against the fence, so I make sure to push in the proper direction so that it doesn't wander. Then I switched the router table over to this bigger bullnose router bit. I think this one was a 3/4 inch if I remember correctly. This is so that I can add handles into the sides. Like the juice grooves, I set up 2 stop blocks for the handles. These are much closer because the handles are smaller. Then I add the handles to the ends of the boards. This was much easier than the juice grooves because there was a lot less material. After that, I added chamfer. I was going to do a roundover, but I didn't have a roundover bit small enough. Although the chamfer didn't work inside the handles because the bearing kept hitting the bottom of the handle. So I used a utility knife to kind of add the chamfer by hand. I then get out my sander to start sanding. Sanding is the least enjoyable part of the process because it's very time consuming and slow. I start off by sanding with 100 grit. This is because they were already pretty smooth from the drum sander. I also have to sand the juice grooves and the handles. This part was very tedious because it was a lot of hand sanding. I definitely didn't enjoy that. I made sure to water pop in between each grit. This raises the grain and helps ensure the boards end up smoother. Then I have to sand more. After that, I use Shaper Origin to add my logo to the bottom of the boards. I don't own a branding iron for some reason, so I use Shaper Origin instead. It's a little bit slower than a branding iron, but it works perfectly fine. After that, it's time for finish. I'm using a homemade finish. It's completely food safe, and it's made from like beeswax and a couple of other waxes and oils. But if you'd like a good store-bought one to get, the Howard's Butcher Block Conditioner is great. Check out that walnut and the way it pops when the finish goes on. And this end grain definitely absorbs a lot. It's because it's more porous, although end grain does have its benefits, like the fact that it absorbs the impact from your knives and helps keep them sharper longer. After that, I add feet to the bottoms of the boards. I start off by pre-drilling. Then I screw the feet on. The reason I'm adding feet to these boards is because they're a little bit bigger and you don't want all that surface area touching the counter, because if there's anything on top of the counter, they'll rock back and forth. Afterward, I flip the boards over and check to make sure they're not rocking back and forth on the feet. Check out these finished boards. They came out amazing. They were a fun and easy project to make. I enjoyed building them, and I hope you enjoyed watching the video. If so, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.